3 hours after my husband locked me out of our house during a Pennsylvania blizzard, his phone rang with the one call he never imagined receiving. A detective told him his 52-year-old wife had been found unconscious in the snow, suffering from hypothermia and a head injury. There was also a gray SUV seen near the scene. But the first question my husband asked wasn't whether I was alive. It was whether I had told the police what he had done. My name is Sabine Hollowell, and everything happened because my husband chose to believe one folder full of lies instead of the 14 years we had spent building a life together. What he didn't know was that his son's story was only the beginning of a fraud that would destroy his family, his business, and every certainty he thought he had. Chapter 1. 14 years against one folder. 3 hours after Graham locked me out in the snow, the phone in our kitchen rang. Detective Mara Velez told him I was at Allegheny Bay Medical Center with hypothermia, a head wound, and an irregular heartbeat. A retired nurse had found me unconscious beside a rural road outside Fairview Township. A gray SUV had been seen near the place where I fell. Graham asked whether I had accused him of hurting me. Mara told him he should be asking whether his wife was going to be all right. Nolan was standing close enough to hear the conversation. He said something, then one careless word that made Graham turn and look at him differently for the first time that night. But that came later. 3 hours earlier, I was standing in my own kitchen, while lake-effect snow struck the windows hard enough to sound like handfuls of gravel. The weather alert had warned that the wind chill could drop near 8 degrees. I was wearing a thin wool sweater, gray slacks, and the flats I used around the house. Graham stood on the other side of the kitchen island with his arms folded. At 59, he still had the broad shoulders that had once made me feel protected. His son stood beside him. Nolan was 33, recently unemployed, and wearing the same calm expression he used whenever he had already decided how a conversation would end. A folder lay open between them. It looked like evidence because Nolan had arranged it to look like evidence. He said I had tried to transfer $82,500 from an account connected to Lakeshore Ridge Motors. He said I had contacted a real estate broker about selling the house quickly. He said I had taken the watch Graham's father left him. He said I had been preparing legal documents to strip Graham of control over his finances and medical decisions. According to Nolan, I had been planning to take the money and disappear. He never handed me the folder. He showed Graham one page at a time, always giving him the conclusion before I could examine the source. The transfer screenshot appeared to show the money had already left the account. The email to the broker looked almost identical to mine. A draft sale agreement had my name typed at the bottom. Then Nolan played the recording. My own voice came through his phone, clipped and cold. Graham will no longer be able to make the decision. We need power of attorney. I recognized the words. They came from a call with my attorney, Vivian Chen. I had been discussing what would happen if Graham ever suffered a stroke and lost the ability to communicate. The original sentence had not sounded anything like that. I looked at Graham and asked him to call Keystone Community Bank. He refused. I asked him to call Vivian and let her explain the recording. He refused again. I asked Nolan to open the original email so we could inspect the address and the file information. Nolan shook his head. He said I was stalling because I needed time to erase whatever I had missed. I told Graham I was the person who had reported the suspicious transfer. Nolan answered before my husband could speak. He said that was exactly what someone would claim after being caught. That was when I understood Graham had not come into the kitchen to ask questions. He had come to deliver a verdict. Nolan reached into the folder and placed a small wooden box on the counter. It belonged to Graham's father. The box was empty. Graham's face changed when he saw it. The watch inside had been the one thing he kept from his father's personal effects after the funeral. I told him I had sent it to a jeweler for repair 3 weeks earlier. The receipt was upstairs in my office. All he had to do was walk up the stairs and look. Nolan said a woman who understood documents as well as I did could manufacture a receipt. Graham stayed where he was. That hurt more than the accusation itself. He did not fail to find the truth. He refused to take 20 steps toward it. Then Nolan unfolded a copy of the deed to the house. Only my name appeared on it. Graham had received copies of those documents years earlier, but he had always handed everything back to Vivian or me without reading closely. Admitting that in front of his son embarrassed him, and Nolan knew exactly how to use it. He told Graham I had kept him dependent on me. I explained that I bought the house in April of 2010, months before Graham and I met. The legal agreement we signed after our marriage protected his legitimate contributions. I had never threatened him with the house or used it to control him. Nolan leaned toward his father and reminded him of Lydia. Graham's first wife had emptied $42,000 from their joint account and left in 2010. Graham had spent years believing the worst part was not the money. It was that everyone else seemed to recognize the betrayal before he did. Nolan told him he had missed the warning signs once before. I watched my husband begin to see me through the shape of an old wound I had never caused. I told him I was not Lydia. He said he believed his son. 5 words. 14 years of marriage, reduced to 5 words. I asked whether he truly intended to place a folder he had not verified above everything he knew about me. He gave me 10 minutes to leave. He said I could return when the money was back. I turned toward the hallway and saw that my coat was still hanging beside the door. My blood pressure medication sat on the kitchen counter. My phone was near Nolan's elbow. My wallet was in the drawer, where I always kept it. Nolan had already taken my passport and several personal documents upstairs. He told Graham I had packed them because I planned to run. I pointed to my coat. I pointed to the medicine. I asked Graham to look at what he was doing. He said I was not taking the phone because I would use it to destroy evidence. I told him to call the police and let them inspect everything. He refused. I asked to remain in the heated garage while the bank verified the transfer. He refused. I asked for my coat, my medication, and my phone. He refused all 3. The snow struck the storm door behind him. For a moment, nobody spoke. Graham opened the door and told me to go. Nolan stood behind him with the quiet posture of someone watching a plan succeed. I stepped onto the porch. The wind cut through my sweater before the door even closed. Graham turned the deadbolt from inside. Then he switched off the porch light while I was still standing on the top step. I waited. I told myself he would calm down. He would look at the receipt. He would call the bank. He would open the door and say he had made a terrible mistake. I heard no footsteps coming back. The nearest occupied house was several hundred feet away. I crossed the snow-covered yard and knocked until my fingers hurt, but no one answered. The property on the other side was a seasonal home that had been empty since fall. The only place I knew would still be open was a gas station about 8/10 of a mile away. I started walking. Snow slipped into my flats almost immediately. Within minutes, my toes began to ache, then slowly stopped aching at all. I thought of the year I paid Nolan's tuition so he would not have to leave school. I thought of the jewelry my mother had left me, sold to keep Graham's dealership alive during its worst year. Those memories did not comfort me. They only showed me how long I had confused being needed with belonging. I kept my arms wrapped around my body and lowered my head against the wind. Then I heard an engine behind me. Headlights swept across the road. A gray Ford Edge slowed as it approached. The light caught a dent along the right rear panel. Nolan's SUV had the same dent. I turned, trying to see the plate. My foot struck black ice. The road disappeared beneath me. My temple hit the frozen curb, and the world tilted sideways. Through the snow, I saw the SUV stop. It remained there for several seconds, long enough for the driver to see a woman lying motionless near the road. Then the red taillights moved away and vanished into the storm. Chapter 2. 6 weeks under my roof. 6 weeks earlier, Nolan had arrived at our house carrying 2 suitcases and the expression of a man who had already rehearsed every reason we should feel sorry for him. It was December 18th, a gray afternoon, with old snow packed along the edges of the driveway. Graham opened the front door before Nolan reached the porch. His son said Northline Logistics Software had eliminated his position during a restructuring. He said his girlfriend had ended the relationship because he had become impossible to live with after losing the job. He said he only needed a few months to recover, apply for work, and get back on his feet. Graham looked at me the way he always did when Nolan needed rescuing. There was hope in that look, but there was pressure too. It asked me to make the difficult thing easier before anyone had to name what it would cost. I agreed Nolan could stay, because I still thought of him as family. I had known him since he was 19. I had helped him through college bills, bad relationships, and more than one crisis Graham insisted would be the last. But I set rules. He could not enter the rooms where we kept dealership records. He could not use Graham's accounts or credit cards. He could not ask anyone in the family for money. If gambling had become a problem again, he had to enter treatment. Nolan agreed before I finished speaking. He smiled and said he understood completely. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made something inside me tighten. Within days, he began testing the edges of every rule without breaking one openly enough for Graham to confront. He called the house Dad's place when he spoke to friends on the phone. He told someone I had married into the dealership, as if Graham had built Lakeshore Ridge Motors alone, and I had simply appeared after the work was done. When he talked about money, he called it our family money. When he referred to me, I became Dad's wife. He moved boxes in my office without asking. He shifted files from one cabinet to another because he said the guest room felt cramped and he needed space to work on applications. When I moved them back, Graham asked me not to make Nolan feel unwelcome. He told me to be the bigger person. I had heard that phrase so many times over the years that I understood what it really meant. It meant I was expected to absorb the harm, so nobody else had to endure the discomfort of addressing it. Nolan's questions started casually. He asked what the house might sell for in the spring. He asked whether Graham's name was on the deed. He asked who could sign dealership documents if Graham became sick. He asked whether I could stop Graham from borrowing against his share of the business. I answered vaguely and changed the subject. Before I became a risk consultant, I spent years investigating insurance fraud. People rarely reveal their intentions in a single dramatic confession. They reveal them through repetition. The same question asked in slightly different ways. The same subject approached from different directions. A detail that matters too much to someone who claims to be merely curious. Nolan also began taking calls outside. He would stand in the backyard with one hand over his other ear, lowering his voice whenever I passed a window. A dark sedan stopped along the road one afternoon, remained there for less than a minute, then drove away. Another day, Nolan signed for a thick envelope and pushed it beneath his jacket before coming inside. A week before Christmas, I heard him say he would have the money by Monday. When I asked whether it was connected to a job interview, he said yes. He answered too quickly. The dealership had been part of my life almost as long as Graham had. I was never listed as an employee, but I had built the payment controls Bethany Rowe used during audits. I tracked insurance deadlines because Graham forgot them during busy sales months. I found a reporting error that prevented a $34,000 penalty. In 2022, I helped Marcus Hale preserve a fleet contract worth roughly $310,000 a year. Graham called all of it helping out. That description made the work sound temporary and informal. It also made it easier for everyone to ignore how much depended on it. One afternoon, Marcus called me from the dealership. He said Nolan had been asking employees about credit limits, outstanding loans, and which accounts required more than one approval. Nolan had also told 2 sales managers that I wanted Graham to sell the business and retire. I asked Graham whether he had authorized Nolan to review financial information. He said Nolan was only trying to understand the family business. When I told him the questions were too specific, Graham sighed and said I was turning curiosity into an investigation. The truth was that Graham had spent years teaching Nolan that scrutiny was something other people did to him, never something his own behavior deserved. In 2018, Nolan had caused an accident after drinking. Graham paid $17,800 in legal fees and civil costs because he said one mistake should not destroy his son's future. In 2020, Graham's sister Delia loaned Nolan $9,500. Nolan later denied the loan had ever existed, and Graham repaid her quietly to prevent a family fight. Then in October of 2024, Nolan asked me for $25,000 to consolidate debt.
I asked whether the debt came from gambling. He did not answer directly. I told him I would pay a treatment provider myself. I would help with counseling assessment and a legitimate recovery program. I would not hand him cash. He stared at me as if I had insulted him. Later, he told Graham I wanted him removed from the family. I had warned Graham more than once that every time he rescued Nolan from a consequence, he made the next lie easier. Graham said I did not understand what a father owed his son. On January 8th, I received an alert showing a login from a device I did not recognize. Graham said it was probably a software update. On January 15th, I found a request to transfer $82,500 into an LLC I had never seen before. The transaction was still pending because Keystone Community Bank had flagged it for additional verification. The next morning, I contacted the bank. Kendra Miles opened a fraud case and asked me not to confront anyone until the device records and transaction history could be preserved. On January 20th, I called Mara Velez. Mara and I had worked around the same fraud investigations years earlier, but she was careful not to blur a personal conversation with an official case. She told me only how to preserve what I already had. Do not access Nolan's devices. Do not alter files. Save original emails. Photograph screens with visible dates and times. She did not pull records or open an investigation based on our history. I also sent copies to Vivian Chen. Vivian confirmed the house remained my separate property and that our post-nuptial documents protected both Graham's legitimate contributions and my ownership. She reminded me that Nolan could not transfer the property using authority granted by Graham. Then she mentioned a file from 2019. It contained documents I had asked her to prepare after one of Graham's health scares. The purpose had been to guarantee that Graham could remain in the house if something happened to me. Graham had never signed them, because he said married people should not need paperwork to prove they had a home. The irony did not feel important then. A few days later, I found a sheet in the printer tray covered with Graham's signature, repeated in different sizes and angles. I photographed it and left it exactly where it was. That evening, Nolan left his laptop open on the dining table. I saw the name of an audio editing program on the screen. I did not touch the keyboard. I only noted the software and the time. After that, Nolan changed. He stopped challenging me directly. Around Graham, he became quiet and reluctant. He said he did not want to damage his father's marriage, but he was worried. I knew too much about the accounts. I called lawyers without explaining why. I kept documents Graham had never read. I might be preparing to leave. Then Nolan used the one memory Graham had never fully escaped. He reminded him of Lydia. He said Graham had not seen the betrayal coming the first time. Over the next several days, Graham began watching me differently. He asked why Vivian had called. He checked a drawer in my office and pretended he was looking for a pen. He wanted to know why I was carrying documents to work. I wanted to tell him everything, but the bank had not finished preserving its records, and Vivian warned that whoever created the transfer could erase evidence or change tactics if confronted too early. I was not keeping information from Graham to control him. I was trying to protect the truth long enough for it to survive. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than expected. Nolan was standing inside my office. The top drawer of my desk was open. He turned when he heard me, empty-handed and completely calm. He said I had always liked building a case. That was the moment I understood he knew I was watching him. More importantly, he was no longer trying to hide from the investigation. He was building one of his own. Behind him on the upper shelf, the wooden box containing Graham's father's watch was still closed. 3 weeks later, that same empty box would be placed on our kitchen counter and used to erase 14 years of my life. Chapter 3. The Evidence He Needed Them to Believe. By the time the truth began catching up with Nolan, I was lying under fluorescent hospital lights with 6 stitches near my temple and no feeling in 2 of my toes.
Marjorie Wells found me before the cold finished what Graham had started. Everyone called her Marnie. She was 64, a retired emergency room nurse, driving home from her sister's house when her headlights caught something dark against the snowbank. She told me later that she nearly passed by because she thought I was a broken branch or a trash bag blown from someone's yard. Then she saw my arm. Marnie pulled over and called 911 before she opened her car door. Years of emergency work had taught her not to become a second victim on an icy road. She took a reflective vest and an emergency blanket from her trunk, wrapped the blanket around me, and kept speaking, even though I could not answer. "You're not alone, honey. Help is coming. Just stay with me." A gray SUV was moving away when she looked up. She could not read the full plate through the snow, so she wrote the number she remembered across her wrist with a pen. She remained beside me until the ambulance doors closed. At Allegheny Bay Medical Center, Dr. Ethan Cole diagnosed mild to moderate hypothermia, a concussion, a deep cut at my temple, an irregular heartbeat caused by cold and stress, and early cold injury in my feet. He wanted me monitored for at least 36 hours. When I finally surfaced, the room was too bright, and the monitor beside me sounded louder than it should have. The first thing I asked was the time. The second was for someone to call Detective Mara Velez. Mara arrived with another investigator from the Erie County Detective Bureau. She explained that because we had worked around some of the same fraud cases years earlier, she had already disclosed our professional history to her supervisor. The second investigator would remain involved to make sure every decision was documented independently. Mara pulled a chair beside my bed. "Start with the moment Graham opened the door." I told her everything in order. I told her Graham had locked me outside. Nolan had kept my phone and medication. I had seen a vehicle that resembled Nolan's Ford Edge. Nolan knew about the bank inquiry. I had fallen on black ice after turning toward the headlights. I did not say Nolan had tried to kill me. I did not even say he had caused me to fall. Mara stopped me when I began describing what I thought the driver must have seen. "We separate what you know from what you believe," she said. "That protects you as much as it protects the case. What I know is that the vehicle stopped. That matters. But we prove it before we name the reason." The first pieces came together faster than I expected. Marnie provided the partial plate number. Security footage from the gas station showed a gray Ford Edge passing shortly after I left the house. Pennsylvania State Police checked automated plate reader data and confirmed that Nolan's vehicle left our road past the gas station, then circled back through the area before returning home. Kendra Miles from Keystone Community Bank reported another development. Someone had attempted to access the flagged account and canceled the fraud review. The device had previously been registered using Nolan's information. None of that proved the full scheme. It did prove Nolan had lied about remaining at home. Mara called Graham from the hallway, while the second investigator stayed with me. I could not hear every word from the other end, but I heard Mara clearly. "Mr. Hollowell, your wife is at Allegheny Bay Medical Center. She was found unconscious beside the road with hypothermia and a head injury." Graham's voice rose through the phone. "The hospital? What happened?" "You need to come here." Nolan tried to stop him from leaving. Graham later admitted that Nolan said, "I might have put myself in danger deliberately to make them feel guilty." He warned Graham that the police could be trying to bait him into admitting responsibility. Then Nolan made his mistake. "This accident doesn't prove she didn't steal the money." Graham looked at him. What accident? Nolan claimed he had heard Mara use the word. She had not. Graham arrived less than an hour later. He stopped inside the doorway of my room. His eyes moved from the bandage at my temple to the IV taped to my hand, then to the clear hospital bag holding my wet sweater and ruined flats. He looked at my feet last, where the skin along my toes was still discolored from the cold. Whatever explanation he had prepared disappeared from his face. "Sabine, I didn't know."
You knew it was snowing. My voice was weak, but I did not need to raise it. He took one step toward the bed. I thought you would go somewhere for the night.
Where he opened his mouth, then closed it. I had no phone, no wallet, no coat, no medication. The nearest neighbor didn't answer, and you turned off the porch light while I was still standing there. I was angry. You were willing to let anger decide whether I was safe. He said he had intended to look for me in the morning. I asked whether he truly believed I could survive outside until morning, or whether he had simply refused to think about what might happen after he locked the door. He had no answer. Mara entered and placed several printed images on the rolling table. The footage did not show Nolan striking me or forcing me from the road. It showed his Ford Edge leaving the neighborhood. It showed the vehicle passing near the place where I fell. It showed the brake lights brightening as the SUV slowed. The plate reader timestamps showed it returning home afterward. Graham stared at the pages. Nolan was in the living room with me. He was there before and after Mara said. The vehicle data shows he left in between. That doesn't make sense. It makes sense if he lied. The certainty in Graham's expression began to fracture. Then Kendra joined by secure phone. She confirmed the transfer had never been completed. The $82,500 remained frozen in the verification process. I had reported the request before Nolan showed Graham the screenshot. The image from the folder had been cropped to remove the words pending verification. Graham looked at me. Why didn't you tell me? The bank asked me not to alert whoever was behind it until they preserved the records. You should have trusted me. Vivian Chen, who had arrived while Mara was gathering statements, spoke from the chair near the window. Sabine's decision to follow a fraud investigator's instructions did not give you the right to take her medication and send her into a storm. Graham looked away. Vivian opened her folder and placed a repair receipt on the table. It showed that I had delivered Graham's father's watch to a jeweler 3 weeks earlier. The store had reviewed its camera footage after Vivian contacted them. Nolan had collected the watch, claiming he was doing so for Graham. He knew the identifying details and had shown an image of the claim ticket. The store should have verified the pickup more carefully. But the footage proved I had not stolen the watch. The wooden box had been emptied deliberately and placed where Graham would find it. He sat down as if his knees had weakened. Nolan said you were trying to take everything. Nolan built the lie, I said. But you turned the lock. Graham looked at me then, and I could see how badly he wanted evidence of Nolan's guilt to erase his own decision. It could not. I told him he was not returning to the house while the investigation was active. He could retrieve essential belongings only with an officer present. Nolan was not to enter the property under any circumstances. Graham nodded slowly. What does this mean for us? I am not deciding my marriage tonight with stitches in my head. But finding out Nolan lied does not make what you did disappear. Mara's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway, listened for less than a minute, then returned. The attempted back access and the risk of destroyed evidence had been included in an emergency affidavit. A judge on duty had approved a digital search warrant at 2:18 that morning. Officers were already heading toward the house. At that moment, an alert appeared on the tablet linked to our doorbell security account. With my permission, Mara opened the cloud recording. Nolan was inside the garage. He carried a small gasoline can in one hand and a cardboard file box in the other. Graham leaned closer to the screen. He told me he was staying at the house. Nolan set the box beside a metal bin. He pulled out stacks of paper, dropped them inside, and poured gasoline over them. Mara was already calling the patrol team. On the screen, Nolan reached into his pocket and removed a lighter. For the first time that night, Graham did not say his son must have had a reason. Chapter 4. The Plan Beneath the Lie. The patrol officers reached the house before Nolan could do more than blacken the first layer of paper. He had dropped the lighter into the metal bin when they entered the garage. The flame caught briefly, then collapsed beneath the wet weight of the gasoline-soaked documents. Smoke spread along the ceiling, but the fire never reached the walls. Nolan tried to close the laptop before an officer reached him. When that failed,
He struck it against the concrete floor. He pulled out his phone and began pressing at the screen with both thumbs.
The officers took both devices before he could destroy either one. By sunrise, Nolan was in custody. What followed did not unfold in one clean revelation. It came in pieces over the next several days, each piece removing another excuse Graham had used to avoid seeing his son clearly. The initial search of the garage, Nolan's room, and the Ford Edge uncovered a prepaid phone used to receive verification codes. Graham's father's watch was hidden in a compartment beneath the rear cargo floor of the SUV. Investigators found pages covered with Graham's signature repeated until Nolan's hand had almost learned its shape. There was a draft financial power of attorney, an unsigned loan application, and a quitclaim deed that would have transferred my house. My name was typed beneath a signature that Nolan had not finished practicing well enough to use. The laptop screen was broken, but the storage drive remained intact. His phone contained messages from people demanding $58,000 by February 3rd. One message warned that excuses were over. Another said Nolan had already been given more time than he deserved. The charges connected to the garage focused on evidence tampering, criminal mischief, and the risk he had created by bringing gasoline into an attached structure. No one claimed he had tried to burn down the house, when the evidence showed he had been trying to destroy records. The truth was serious enough without stretching it. Owen Pike, a digital forensics specialist working with the investigators, recovered the rest over the next few weeks. The email sent to the real estate broker had been created on Nolan's laptop. The address differed from mine by one letter. The transfer screenshot had been cropped. The attempt to cancel the bank's fraud review came from the same device. The LLC listed as the receiving account had been registered under the name of an old friend, but the controlling email address and prepaid number both led back to Nolan. Then Owen restored the full recording of my call with Vivian. Graham listened to it in Vivian's office. My voice sounded tired, but clear. I want Graham making his own decisions for as long as he possibly can. A few seconds later, I explained that any power of attorney should take effect only after doctors determined he could no longer understand or communicate his choices. Nolan had removed every sentence that protected Graham's independence. He kept only the fragments that made me sound like I intended to take it away. Graham sat across from Vivian, with both hands resting on his knees. He made it sound like she was planning to control me. Vivian closed the audio file. She was planning to protect you from being controlled. That was when she explained the property documents fully. I had purchased the house in April of 2010. Graham moved in the following February. We married 4 months later. In August of 2012, we signed a post-nuptial property agreement confirming the house as my separate property while protecting Graham's legitimate contributions to improvements. He had received copies of everything. He simply had not read them. In 2019, after one of his dizzy spells, I asked Vivian to prepare an agreement that would protect Graham's right to remain in the house if I died first or became unable to manage my affairs. Graham had delayed signing it. He had said married people should not need documents to prove they had a home. The woman Nolan accused of preparing to take Graham's house had once tried to guarantee that he would never lose it. The $82,500 was only the beginning of Nolan's plan. He needed Graham afraid and angry. He needed me removed from the house and separated from my phone, my files, and the bank investigation. He planned to convince Graham to sign the financial power of attorney, giving Nolan access to personal accounts and authority connected to Graham's share of Lakeshore Ridge Motors. Because Graham could not transfer my house, Nolan intended to forge my signature on the quitclaim deed and supporting loan documents. He believed he could borrow enough against the business and the false property records to pay the $58,000 due immediately. Then, according to searches recovered from his laptop, he planned to win the money back through gambling before anyone noticed. There was also an application for a $625,000 life insurance policy on Graham. It was still in underwriting and had never taken effect. The signature and contact information had been falsified. The prosecutors did not present it as evidence that Nolan wanted his father dead. it showed something else. There was no financial boundary Nolan considered real if it stood between him and money. Bethany Rowe confirmed that Nolan had asked for access to payment records at Lakeshore Ridge Motors. Marcus Hale confirmed that Nolan had been telling employees I wanted to sell the dealership and force Graham into retirement. When I formally withdrew from every unpaid role I had performed, Graham had to hire outside accounting support for $2,750 a month, along with a compliance consultant. The dealership did not collapse. It simply began paying market value for work Graham had spent years calling help. Delia also turned over the messages, proving Nolan had borrowed $9,500 from her and denied it. The records from the 2018 accident showed how much Graham had paid to contain that consequence too. Graham did not create Nolan's crimes, but he had spent years teaching his son that when consequences arrived, his father would be the person who paid them. On February 4th, I attended Nolan's initial hearing. The stitches were still in my temple, and I moved slowly because my balance had not fully returned. Graham sat several rows away. Without the folder and the carefully controlled kitchen table, Nolan looked smaller. His confidence had become restless movements, clenched hands, and quick glances toward his father. He insisted he had only been trying to protect Graham from me. He admitted following me in the Ford Edge, but claimed he wanted to make sure I left the neighborhood. I did not make her fall. Assistant District Attorney Claire Donnelly did not claim that he had. She described what the evidence showed. Nolan's vehicle slowed near where I was found. He did not call for help. He returned home and lied about leaving. Later, he tried to destroy evidence. The facts were enough. Nolan looked at me. That house was supposed to stay in the Hollowell family. I felt something inside me become still. I was your family for 14 years. He looked away. You only remembered that word when you wanted money, labor, or property from me. The court set bail conditions Nolan could not meet alone. As officers prepared to lead him away, he turned to Graham. Dad, call a bondsman. You can use the dealership interest. Just get me out and I'll fix this. Graham did not answer. Nolan leaned forward. You've helped me before. The desperation in his voice made the pattern impossible to miss. He was not asking whether Graham believed him anymore. He was asking whether Graham would pay. Then Nolan looked toward me. If you leave me here, she wins. Graham turned in my direction. For years, that look would have been enough to make me step in. I would have explained the options, softened the conflict, or helped him find a solution he could live with. This time I gave him nothing. No nod, no warning, no permission. The decision belonged to him. No, Graham said. Nolan stared at him. What? I'm not paying the bond. I'm not securing it with the dealership. You have to face what you did. Nolan's composure broke. She took you from me. Graham's voice remained low. Sabine didn't take me anywhere. You showed me the man I allowed myself to become. The officers led Nolan away. Graham remained in the courthouse hallway after everyone else began moving toward the exits. I did not go to him. His refusal to rescue Nolan was not redemption. It was only the first consequence he had finally allowed his son to keep. And for the first time in 14 years, Graham stood alone with the responsibility of deciding what kind of man he would become next. Chapter 5. Forgiveness Without a Key. I left the courthouse without waiting to see what Graham decided to do with the silence Nolan had left behind. 2 days earlier, on February 2nd, I had been discharged from Allegheny Bay Medical Center with instructions to rest, monitor my heart rate, and return immediately if the dizziness worsened. Vivian drove me home. A deputy met us at the property, and for the first time in 14 years, I entered my own house as if it were a place that needed to be cleared for danger. The deed still carried my name. The locks still recognized my key. None of that made me feel safe. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place made my shoulders tighten. Before leaving any room, I checked that my phone was in my pocket.
I kept my medication in my purse instead of on the kitchen counter. For weeks, I woke in the dark, convinced I could hear wind striking the storm door. Owning the house did not erase what had happened inside it. On February 7th, I met Graham at Vivian's office and placed a legal separation agreement in front of him.
The document listed the personal property he could retrieve, the process for supervised access to the house, and the temporary division of our financial obligations. I did not find him an apartment. I did not call landlords, fill out applications, or pay a deposit. Graham used his own money to lease a small place across town. I gave him a reasonable period to collect his belongings. I did not leave him without shelter, but I stopped treating his comfort as my responsibility. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I also withdrew completely from Lakeshore Ridge Motors. I stopped answering calls from customers who had grown accustomed to reaching me when Graham was unavailable. I stopped reviewing payment schedules, correcting insurance reports, reminding people about filing deadlines, and smoothing disagreements between Graham and his employees. Bethany Rowe expanded her role. Graham hired outside accounting support at $2,750 a month and brought in a compliance consultant. The dealership lost some profit, but it did not fail. It simply began paying for work I had performed for free. Marcus Hale later told me he had said something to Graham that finally made him understand. Sabine never controlled this business. She kept it from losing control. Graham did not call me to argue. He started attending a support group for parents of adult children with addiction. He began individual counseling to address the betrayal from his first marriage and the years he had spent avoiding hard truths about Nolan. He read the documents he had once handed to me without looking at them. When legal questions arose, he contacted Vivian instead of asking me to solve them. He changed slowly, without demanding that I witness every step. I respected that. Respect was not reconciliation. On July 21st, Nolan accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to multiple offenses involving forgery, identity theft, attempted theft by deception, unauthorized access to financial accounts, evidence tampering, and criminal mischief connected to the documents he tried to burn in the garage. The negotiated sentence placed him in state prison for a multi-year term with a maximum of approximately 5 years. Restitution followed him. So did supervised probation and mandatory gambling addiction treatment after his release. The prosecution included his decision to leave me unconscious in the snow when presenting the full pattern of his conduct. They did not claim he caused my fall or tried to kill me. The truth did not need exaggeration. He saw me. He chose not to stop. That was enough for me to understand who he had become. My divorce from Graham was finalized on August 29th. He did not challenge my ownership of the house. The post-nuptial property agreement gave him fair reimbursement for documented improvements he had funded over the years. I retained my separate property and accounts. He did not lose everything. He lost the marriage. He lost the invisible system that had kept his household and business stable, while allowing him to believe he was carrying them alone. In September, I listed the house for sale. People assumed I would keep it, because keeping it looked like victory. Nolan had tried to take it. Graham had ordered me out of it. My name was the only one on the deed. But every time I looked at the front door, my body remembered standing outside it in 8-degree wind. A house can belong to you legally and still stop feeling like home. It sold in November. The following month, I bought a smaller place in northeast Pennsylvania, close enough to Lake Erie that I could sometimes hear the water when the wind moved in the right direction. It had a modest porch, wide windows, and an outdoor light that cast a warm circle across the steps. I kept that light on when I expected someone. With part of the sale proceeds, I worked with Rachel Kim and the Erie Women's Legal Resource Center to establish the Evelyn Mercer Financial Safety Fund in my mother's name. I contributed $75,000 to help women over 45 dealing with financial abuse, forged debt, property disputes, misused powers of attorney, and the complicated legal work of leaving a relationship safely. I did not create the fund because I believed suffering automatically made a person noble. I created it because information had protected me, and too many women discovered their rights only after someone had already tried to take them. Near the end of December, Graham asked if he could visit. He called first. He waited until I agreed. When he arrived, he remained on the porch instead of reaching for the door. He held an old set of keys in his palm. They no longer opened anything that belonged to me. I stepped outside wearing a winter coat. Graham looked older than he had 11 months earlier. He said he had not come to ask me to change the divorce. Then he apologized without hiding behind Nolan. He admitted he had refused to show me the full folder. He had refused to call the bank or Vivian. He had seen my code medication wallet and phone and still denied them to me. He had known there was a severe weather warning. He had turned off the porch light because he wanted me to feel punished. He said he had taken a wound from his first marriage and used it to judge a woman who had never caused it. He admitted the part that mattered most. Nolan's lies had not nearly killed me by themselves. Graham's actions had given those lies power. I listened until he finished. I told him I accepted the apology. Relief moved across his face too quickly, and I stopped it before it could become hope. Accepting his apology did not mean the damage was repaired. It meant I no longer wanted to carry the weight of waiting for him to understand. He asked whether there might be another chance someday. I told him our marriage had ended on the night he locked the door. The work he was doing now had to be for the man he wanted to become, not as payment for getting me back. Then I looked at the keys in his hand. Forgiveness does not come with a key. Graham nodded. He did not argue. He walked down the steps and returned to his car alone. I watched him leave without triumph. There had been good years between us. I could mourn them without returning to the place where I had stopped being safe. That evening, Marnie came for dinner with Rachel, Bethany, and several friends. Marnie arrived carrying a new emergency blanket. She said every woman should keep one in her car, especially a woman with my talent for finding trouble in a snowstorm. For the first time, we laughed about something connected to that night. I opened the door and let them inside. The porch light remained on. Snow rested along the railing, soft and undisturbed. My phone was charged and secure in my pocket. My medication was exactly where I had chosen to keep it. I wore warm socks and a coat I had bought for myself. The keys were in my hand. 11 months earlier, I had stood outside a dark house while someone else decided whether I deserved shelter. Now I stood inside a home filled with the voices of people I had chosen. Nolan faced the consequences of what he had done. Graham had to live with the cost of what he had chosen. The dealership paid real money for the labor it had once treated as invisible. But none of that was the revenge that mattered most. My revenge was stepping out of a system that had survived by consuming my work, my silence, and my forgiveness. It was building a life where I no longer needed anyone else to believe me before I was allowed to trust myself. After everyone came inside, I closed the door and turned the lock. Not to punish anyone standing outside, to protect the peace living within. The key stayed in my hand. Could you forgive Graham without taking him back? Tell me where you would have drawn the line, and subscribe for more stories about women who finally chose safety, truth, and themselves.